Buenos dias. Good day, everybody. Today, what I would like to do is introduce you to the Amazon Research Center for Ornamental Fishes in Iquitos, Peru. Tell you who we are, tell you what we do, and tell you what we plan to do. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody. So again, we are the Amazon Research Center for Ornamental Fishes in Iquitos, Peru. Here is a Google map of South America showing Peru here, and Iquitos is in the northeast corner of Peru. It is surrounded by three rivers: the Amazon River here to the north, the Rio Itaia here, and the Rio Nanay on the west. Iquitos is the largest city in the world, in which the only way to get to it is to fly into the city or take a series of boat rides up and down the rivers, and finally take a road that is 35 miles long into Iquitos itself. The research center is located about 7.5 kilometers south of the city. Here is the research center here on the Nauta Road. Right now at the research center, we have a series of buildings that we've already constructed. First, we have, when you first walk into the research center, we have the office and the instrument lab building. So there are two separate rooms here, the front being the general office and the back part being the instrumentation lab. Next to that, we have the fish lab, the wet lab, a large aquarium room filled with aquaria and raceways in which we do some of our research in, as well as we bring fish in to quarantine them before we put them in the public aquarium. The fish lab is also used as a place in which the authorities put in any fish that have been confiscated from illegal importations. So we are the center for that. We receive all those fish, and we're the only facility in Iquitos that is authorized to receive those fish. Next, here we have the workshop, where we keep all of our equipment, all of our construction equipment. We also have dormitories. We have 4 dorms, which are double, triple occupancy for students and researchers from all over to stay. We have a common kitchen area, a dining room, which right now is used as our small conference room, and laundry facilities. And lastly, we have started building our public aquarium. The public aquarium will house fishes from throughout the Iquitos region. It will be used as a environmental education center where we'll bring in school kids, as well as tourists can come here and look and learn about the various aquarium fishes that are found within the Iquitos region. So our research center was founded about 8 years ago on the idea that it would be a research center devoted to the conservation, ecology, and sustainable breeding of Peruvian ornamental fishes. We are the only research center in the world who's devoted exclusively to ornamental fishes. There are many research centers within Peru whose main goal is to increase food fish supplies, but we are the only one in Peru and in the world that devoted exclusively to ornamental fishes. We also are a training center where we'll bring in local fishermen to teach them how to sustainably breed fish during high water this is a time that these fishermen cannot fish. And so it will allow them to continue with a steady income throughout the year and not having to go into other pursuits that may be detrimental to the Amazonian environment. As part of the aquarium, we will establish a junior conservation program. We will bring in school kids. The first round will be devoted to the kids within the small village that the research center is located in. We'll bring them in, teach them all about conservation efforts, teach them about environmental education, teach them about what is happening in the environment that they live in. We have a lot of research pursuits at the Amazon Research Center. One of our main research pursuits right now is the impacts of exotic species in the Peruvian Amazon. Now, exotic species are species that don't belong in a given area. They can impact native species by many different means. They can be predators, competitors, bring parasites, diseases into the area. In some cases, they can hybridize with native species. They can modify habitats. When exotics invade, it changes the environment that will allow other invaders to come in, other exotics to come in. And so they can also spread new diseases and bring in new parasites. Ultimately, what will happen is that native species will be displaced by these exotics, in which case these exotics now are called invasive species. There's a lot of classic examples of exotic species impacting native fish species. The classic example is in the Rift Valley lakes and Lake Victoria in Africa. Lake Victoria had 200 endemic species in the lake, meaning they are found nowhere else but Lake Victoria. To increase food supplies and to allow an income for the peoples of the area, the government officials brought in Nile Perch for cage culture. Nile Perch can get up to 2 meters long, up to 250 kilograms. What happened was, shortly after they established these cage cultures in the 1950s, some of the fish escaped the cages. And what happened is that the Nile perch, with its voracious appetite, ate and consumed the native African cichlids. Now, at this time, there are only 10 species of cichlids in the lake. So 390 species of African cichlids became extinct because of the Nile perch. So devastating effects on the environment. Peru began bringing in exotics into their country back in 1935 when the government introduced lake trout as food fish for local fishermen. They brought these fish into Lake Titicaca, which is in the southern portion of Peru, sharing the common border with Bolivia. The fishermen there did not like trout. And in fact, what happened is that the trout went in and consumed the native fishes that were the traditional fishery of these people. These two species here, the species in the upper left-hand corner here is now extinct, whereas this species here is now getting rarer and rarer. So in fact, what they did, instead of increasing food supplies for these people, they decreased food supplies. And here is a normal catch for these people who live along Lake Titicaca, showing the fishes that they catch. Now, Peru has a lot of problems with exotic species. You can see here, this is a short list or a rough list of the common exotics that are found within Peruvian waters. Most of these fishes, especially the fishes on the right-hand side, were brought in for aquaculture purposes. The tilapians, the trout were brought in again to increase food supplies and also for sport fisheries. Some of these fish were brought in, like the goldfish, grass carp. Some of these carps were brought in for vector control. And one of those is mosquito fish, Gambusia affinis, was brought in and has been brought in to all over the world for mosquito control. In Iquitos, the two main exotics that we find are the blue gourami and guppies. Blue gourami were brought in as part of a fish farm in the Iquitos region. The fish farmer wanted to breed these fish for the aquarium industry to provide another aquarium fish for the country of Peru. During high water, unfortunately, the gourami escaped into the native rivers, and now they're found by the millions within the system. The other fish is the guppy, the common guppy. Guppies were brought into this area for mosquito control, to help combat dengue fever, malaria, and guppies have had drastic impacts on some of the native fishes. Another exotic that we have just discovered a few years ago is tilapia. There are a few tilapia in some of the fish farms around Iquitos. We have found the tilapia have escaped into the native streams. And if they get into the river systems, they will have dramatic effects on native fish populations. Because as we know, tilapia, although most people think of them as herbivorous, once they get into the native environments, they will eat everything and anything they can consume. So the main thrust of our work is on the blue gourami, Trigogaster trichopterus. We are looking at three aspects of the gourami life. If we look first at the distribution of gourami, the green areas of this map are areas in which they are found naturally. The red are areas in which they have been introduced, either accidentally by aquarium practices, or in some cases to increase food supplies of native fishes. In the Iquitos region, the orange lines represent all along these areas in which we found gourami present. The gourami first existed in this area here. This is where the fish farm was. So when the high water came and flooded the pond, it was first introduced into the Nile River, which is on, again, the left-hand side of your screen. Through the years, they found their way upriver and all the way across into the other river system, which is the Itaya River. There are two ways that it could have gotten there. One is that somehow they were transported over land to these areas, or the second way they could have come through is through the Nile River into the Amazon, which is up here, and back down into the Itaya River. No matter how they were introduced into the Itaya River, they are expanding the areas in which we find gouramis. Gouramis are also found outside of Iquitos in some of the smaller streams that are south of Iquitos. And this may be due to the fact that the local aquaculture businesses, especially those that are have aquaculture for Arapima, are using gourami as a live food fish for the Arapima. And in fact, we were able to get a law passed that they no longer can use gourami in their aquaculture practices. One of the problems is that many of these environmental laws are not enforced very well, so the practice is still going on. But we are again trying to prevent that from happening in the future. So this is the area in which gourami first existed. These are small streams that normally are used as open sewage systems within the area. And what happens is during high water, this is high water of that same area, this whole area gets inundated with water. And when it gets inundated, this allows the gouramis to disperse out into the surrounding areas. Most of the time during the dry season, this is where we find gourami. These are, again, these open sewage canals. And we find gouramis in these open sewage canals by the millions. Since they are air breathers, they come to the surface to get their oxygen, and it allows them to survive in these canals that are really devoid of oxygen, especially during the hot weather, while other fishes aren't able to survive. So it provides them a great breeding ground that is undisturbed by other species. And here in the middle, you can see actually the blue gourami, one of the blue gouramis in some of these canals. As the water recedes again, they do collect in some of these small lakes that appear in the area. This water is very still, which are ideal conditions for the gourami to breed. So we're looking at a few things concerning the gourami and their impacts on the native species. One thing we want to know is, when do these fish reproduce? Secondarily, is there competition for food? And lastly, are parasites different in the gourami than they are in the native fishes? In other words, are they bringing in parasites that the native fishes have not been in contact with? So gouramis are bubble nesters. The male will build a bubble nest, entice a female to come into his territory, which is his bubble nest, and in which case he then they will then commence the spawn. The eggs are buoyant, and the male, if eggs get away, the male will then place them in the bubble nest, and he will guard that bubble nest until the eggs hatch. Now, this is a typical spawning seasonality that we see in many fishes that live in riverine systems that have a flood dry stage. In this case, this is measuring the percent of the female gonad weight to the body weight. And as you can see, during the April-May timeline, there is a higher percentage of gonadal weight, of ovary weight in these females than there are in any other time of the year. This will indicate that it's during this time in which the fish will spawn. During the other times of the year, these are, let's say, low water marks, there's no spawning that is occurring by these fish. If we have something like this where it's, comes and goes over the year, and in which the overall line is flat, this indicates that the fish will spawn throughout the year. There's no really big seasonality. There may be some, some little humps along the way, but overall, the fish are breeding throughout the year. So what we wanted to figure out is, what are gourami doing? Are they adapting to the pulse stage of the flood river? In other words, are they breeding during the time where most of the other fish in the Amazon are breeding, or are they doing something differently? So what we did is we went out and caught fish, brought them into the lab, weighed them, and then excised their gonads. So here's a ovary of a typical female, and then we weighed the ovaries to get the GSI, the gonadal-somatic index, for these fish. And what we found that although there are some pulses throughout the year, that overall gourami are spawning throughout the year. There may be a little low periods here and there, but overall we see that we have ripe females any time of the year. So it indicates that the gourami are able to spawn at times in which other fish aren't spawning. So it allows them to reach a large population very rapidly. Secondarily, we're interested in, is there competition for food? Native species normally in their native habitats rely on very specific food in their habitat. Exotic species in their native lands will have very specific food requirements, but when these exotic species find a new area, enter into or invade into an area they're not native to, their food requirements open up. In other words, they then are able to feed on a wide variety of food items. So here we capture the gourami. We have the intestinal tract. We remove the intestinal tract, the GI tract, and empty it into petri dishes. And we categorize what we see in the guts of the gourami. So we captured gourami, and then along with the gourami, we captured any native fishes that were living in the same area alongside the gourami. And here are the results that we found. Here is the species that we found. Trichogaster trichopterus is by far the most abundant fish that we found in our surveys. This is Dianema, is porthole catfish, Astyanax, one of the tetra species, and Pimulus is the Pictus catfish. Those were the 4 most abundant fishes that we found. And you can see in gourami, most of their food was detritus. Detritus was categorized as material you could not identify, had no structure. We did find plant fibers, insect larvae, chironomus, bloodworms, tubifex. We did find some diopteran, some fly, some algae, few fish parts, some ants, and a few other things that include fish scales, pieces of rice, pieces of carbon. Identifiable things that we would not normally think of as food items. And so what we did is we compared all these species to figure out if there's overlap to what the blue gourami are eating. And we did this by calculating the Scherner's index. It calculates the overlap of food items in both species. Indices over 60% will denote a significant degree of dietary overlap. Below 60%, no dietary or no significant dietary overlap. And of the species that we looked at, we had a dietary overlap in 8 different species, of which Cyclosoma amazonorum, one of the small dwarf cichlid species, had the largest dietary overlap, followed by the sardina, followed by Pictus catfish, and then followed by the porthole catfish. So all these species here had a significant dietary overlap with the blue gourami, which indicates that there may be direct competition for food in these areas that they coexist. And because gourami are found in much higher numbers, it appears that gourami may be outcompeting these fish for food items. And one of the last things we did looking at gourami is trying to determine the parasites that both gourami and the native fishes have. Are there differences? Do we find parasites that the gourami are bringing into the environment? There is an idea of the enemy release hypothesis that says that when an exotic species enters a new environment, the native parasites will not invade gouramis. It will not invade the exotic species. So they have this release from these parasites. So it allows them to be a much better competitor than the native species. So these are just a few of the parasites that we found. Here is a parasitic nematode, a fluke, some parasitic rotifers, and one of the assistant stages of some parasites. And what we found overall is that there's really no difference in the parasites that we found on gourami and the native fishes. This may be owed to the fact that gourami have been in the environment for 30, 40 years now. So if they did bring in new parasites, those new parasites are no longer there. So we did not find invasive parasites on our native fishes. Now, this is important because gourami have been shown to bring in diseases and parasites into other countries in which they're imported for the pet industry. One of the diseases is the gourami retrovirus. This virus has been detected in gouramis in pet stores in Australia. And this parasite, this virus, can be transmitted to Murray cod. Murray cod was a very important food fish in Australia. They are declining in numbers, primarily from overfishing. And so they're worried about fish being brought into the country that will impact negatively the Murray cod. And in fact, any gourami that is brought into Australia now has to have a 2-week quarantine period in which they are tested for this virus. Now, we do have some additional ongoing research that is being conducted by myself and my students, as well as students from the Peruvian university we work with. One of the things we're interested in, again, with the fishermen is looking at optimal breeding conditions for the fish. We're interested in looking at, and we have looked at, thermal tolerances between native fishes and exotic fishes. This is really important when we're looking at global warming in the future and now. Do the exotic fishes have a greater thermal tolerance than the native fishes? If they do, that means as global warming increases, you would tend to find more exotic species as opposed to these native species. We have done some work, and we're ongoing work with environmental DNA to try to detect exotic species in areas that we can actually go in and do surveys with seines environmental DNA will allow us to detect the species that are found without actually catching the species. And we're also doing some work with some Peruvian students on some natural products for fish diseases. They are testing products from plant species within the Amazon rainforest to see how effective they are at fighting off and as remedies for fish parasites and fish diseases, not only for the ornamental fish trade, but also for the food fish industry. If you'd like more information on the Amazon Research Center, please go to amazonresearchcenter.org. It'll tell you more about who we are, what we're doing, and what we're trying to do. Thank you very much. And if we have any questions for anybody, you can type them there. But since